heterogeneity, you do see several emerging markets with adequate policy frameworks, adequate buffers, and they will manage it, even if there is shocks coming forward. But there are some countries with very large external financing needs, high exposure to capital outflows, and very low reserve adequacy ratios. We are particularly concerned about those. About half of the countries with external financing needs above 15% of GDP have reserve levels that are well below the reserve adequacy ratios. So these are the groups, and that's what you see highlighted in the bubble. This is the group of emerging markets that really require determined action to contain these risks. Then next slide. This is a further exercise that basically is trying to show two dimensions of vulnerability in emerging markets. One is the exposure that the emerging markets may have to either external and or public debt risks. And the other side of the coin is resilience, because you may have high exposure to these risks, but if you do have strong buffers, you can actually absorb the shocks and you'll be able to weather any future storm. So for us, the group that we are concerned the most is the group in the red quadrant, which are the group of emerging markets that have not only high exposure to external and public debt risks, but also low resilience. Those are countries that have limited buffers to absorb shocks, and again, call for close attention. Now let's move on to the next slide. I'm going to now briefly mention what is happening also in the low-income developing countries when it comes to debt trends. Next. So the first message to pass is that public debt in low-income countries have actually increased significantly since 2013. And again, you have a combination of factors. You know that some of these countries actually did benefit from debt relief, and then they also benefited in those that accessed for the first time international capital markets, benefited from low global interest rates and demand for their paper. There was a search for yield, and so some of these governments also benefited from a lot of demand when they tapped into international markets. But the main message I would like you to keep in mind is that when we did empirical analysis on what was driving this increase in public debt, mainly was really weak macro fiscal framework, so the fundamentals in the economy. Then partly was also adverse shocks. As I mentioned earlier, the commodity price decline for many of these countries that were commodity exporters. Some of these countries faced security challenges and in some cases also natural disasters that drove up borrowing needs. Exchange rate depreciation in some cases also contributed. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, the concern around hidden debt. Some of these countries had built up contingent liabilities that were not recorded or reported, and when they materialized, they had an impact on public debt ratios. Next. The second message I'd like to convey is not only how much these countries borrow, but how they borrow. So here, what we have seen is really a change in the composition of debt compared to the previous decade. Now there is a greater reliance on what we call costlier and riskier sources of finance. These are non-Paris Club lending. It's a greater reliance on collateralized lending, commercial lending,